Ah, hello there, weary traveller. Come in. Come in from the world's noise. There is a place for you here by the hearth. Can you feel its warmth? The scent of old wood and beeswax hangs in the air, a quiet perfume of forgotten time. The embers glow like sleeping dragons, holding stories in their fiery hearts. Tonight, let the firelight not just warm your hands but illuminate a time long past. A time that feels both impossibly distant and hauntingly familiar. We will journey back together, not to a grand battle or the crowning of a king, but to something far more intimate, far more elemental. We are going back to the earth itself, to the sky above it, and to the fragile human lives caught in between. The year is 1314. For a moment, let us picture the world as it was. Europe was breathing, a long, slow, confident breath. For nearly 3 centuries, the climate had been kind. The sun had smiled upon the land, creating a long summer for humankind. The population had swelled, forests had been cleared for sprawling fields, and new towns and cities had risen from the soil like sturdy oaks. Life for many was still brutally hard, of course. It was a world of rigid hierarchy, of serfdom and sickness. But there was a rhythm to it, a predictability. Church bells marked the steady, reliable passing of the days. Market towns buzzed with the murmur of commerce, the smell of fresh bread, and the vibrant colours of dyed wool. From the green fields of England to the vineyards of France, a quiet promise was whispered from the earth itself. There would always be enough. The harvest would come, the granaries would be filled, the winter could be endured. This faith in the soil, in the seasons, was the bedrock of their entire world. It was more fundamental than any king's decree or pope's edict. It was the simple, unspoken contract between humanity and nature. We tend to you, and you provide for us. But the world, as we know, holds its breath only for so long. And contracts, even those written in the language of sun and rain, can be broken. Beneath the surface of this seeming peace, a fragility lay hidden. The population had grown so large that it pressed right up against the limits of what the land could offer. There was no surplus, no room for error. Every harvest was essential, every bushel of grain, a matter of life and death. They were balanced on a knife's edge, and they did not even know it. And then it began. It began not with a crash of thunder or a declaration of war, but with a whisper, a change in the air, a dampness that clung a little too long in the mornings, a sky that seemed to be holding its tears, heavy and grey, refusing to give way to the familiar blue. The birds, perhaps, felt it first, or the old farmers, whose bones ached with the coming wet, a subtle creeping chill that had nothing to do with the coming of autumn. This is the story of what happens when that simple promise is broken, when the sky, the great life-giving canopy above, turns against you. It is the story of the drowning of the world, the story of the Great Famine, and it begins, as so many tragedies do, with a single persistent drop of rain. The spring of 1315 arrived not with the gentle green blush of new life, but with a sky the colour of slate. That single persistent drop of rain we spoke of found its courage. It was joined by another, and then 1,000 more, and then 1,000,000, until the heavens opened in a deluge that would not cease. At first it was a nuisance. Farmers, huddled in the doorways of their cottages, would look out at the sodden fields and grumble. The planting would be delayed, they said. Their wives would sigh, pulling damp laundry from the line, the smell of wet wool and wood smoke filling their small homes. They had seen wet springs before. This was the way of things. The seasons were a wheel, always turning, and the sun would surely return. But it did not. May bled into June, and the rain fell. It was not a violent cleansing storm that raged and then passed. It was a cold, relentless, dispiriting drizzle that soaked the world to its very bones. The sound became the new silence, a constant drumming on thatch roofs, a steady trickling down stone walls, the squelch of mud that swallowed a man's boots to the ankle. The rivers, once placid arteries of commerce and life, began to swell. They grew thick and brown, churning with silt and debris, their banks dissolving, their waters creeping into the low-lying pastures, where sheep huddled together, their fleece heavy and cold. The fields, the very source of life, became a scene of quiet heartbreak. The carefully ploughed furrows dissolved into a uniform sheet of brown water. The precious seeds of wheat, rye and barley, sown with hope and prayer, were either washed away entirely or rotted in the cold, anaerobic mud. A farmer would walk to the edge of his land, the land his father and grandfather had worked, and see not a field of promising green shoots, but a shallow, stagnant lake. There was nothing to do, nothing to fix. He could only stand there, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, and watch his family's future dissolve before his eyes. This was not a local tragedy. From the mist-shrouded hills of Ireland and Scotland, across the Low Countries, through the heartlands of France and the Holy Roman Empire, a continent was slowly drowning. The very air grew heavy with a perpetual dampness. Inside the great stone castles, nobles complained of the chill that seeped through the thickest tapestries. In the monasteries, monks recorded the endless rain in their chronicles, their ink sometimes blurring on the vellum from the humidity. But for the common man, the peasant, it was a far more intimate misery. Everything was damp. Their clothes, their bedding, the straw on the floor. A fire was a constant battle against the wet wood, sputtering and smoking, offering little cheer and even less warmth. The comforting smell of baking bread was replaced by the sour scent of mildew and decay. The world was being washed clean of its colors, leaving only an endless palette of grays and browns. Summer arrived, but the sun did not. The season that should have brought warmth and growth brought only more rain. The few crops that had survived the spring were now stunted and diseased, plagued by fungus and rust that flourished in the wet. The hay, essential fodder for the livestock, could not be cut and dried. It lay in waterlogged fields, turning black and useless. This was a second death blow. A failed grain harvest meant starvation this year. A failed hay harvest meant the death of the precious livestock. The oxen needed to plough, the cows that gave milk, the sheep that gave wool. It meant starvation for the next year and the year after. The people prayed. They filled the churches, their damp clothes steaming in the candlelight, their voices rising in desperate pleas to saints and to God. They held solemn processions, carrying holy relics through the muddy village streets, their bare feet sinking into the mire. They begged for forgiveness, for a sign, for a single day of sun. But the sky remained a merciless, weeping grey. It was as if God had turned his face away, leaving them to the mercy of the indifferent clouds. As summer waned and the bleak, early autumn of 1315 approached, a new kind of quiet began to settle over the land. It was the quiet of resignation, the quiet of dread. The season of harvest had come and gone, and there was nothing to reap but water and mud. The granaries, which should have been overflowing, stood cavernously empty. The cheerful rhythm of the scythe and the communal joy of bringing in the sheaves were replaced by a profound and terrifying silence. The long, dark winter was coming, and for the first time in living memory, the people of Europe would face it with nothing. The silence of the empty fields soon found its echo in the silence of the people. The cheerful chatter of the market square faded. The songs of the tavern grew quiet. A weariness settled into their bones, a heaviness that was more than just the perpetual damp. It was the weight of a dawning, unthinkable reality. Let us imagine a family, for history is not made of statistics, but of heartbeats. Let us call them the Bouchards. Jean, the father, a man whose hands are a map of his life's work, calloused, strong, made for the plough. His wife, Isabel, whose world is the rhythm of the cottage, the garden, and the spinning wheel. They have 2 children, small flames of life that now seem terrifyingly fragile. Their days had once been governed by the sun. Now they were governed by the rain and by hunger. At first it was a manageable thing, a tightening of the belt. The bread was cut a little thinner. The evening stew was made with more water and fewer vegetables. The small stash of dried peas and salted pork, meant to last through the depths of winter, was being opened in autumn. Every crumb was precious, every spoonful a prayer against the future. Jean would spend his days foraging in the dripping woods. his hopes shrinking from finding a stray deer to simply finding edible roots, nuts, or bark, anything the rain had not already turned to rot. Isabel would watch the children, her heart aching at their listless play, at the quiet questions in their eyes. When will we have bread again, Mama? Their story was being repeated, with infinite variations, in a million cottages across the land. The first casualty of the famine was not the body, but the spirit. It was the erosion of certainty, the death of hope. The world, once a place of predictable cycles, had become a realm of cruel whimsy. There was no one to blame, no enemy to fight. There was only the sky and the endless weeping rain. As autumn deepened into the winter of 1315, the situation escalated from hardship to crisis. The price of grain, the very currency of life, began to skyrocket. What little reserves were held by lords and merchants were sold at prices that no common family could afford. A sense of injustice began to curdle alongside the hunger. The age-old bargain, we work the Lord's land, and in times of crisis, the Lord provides, was breaking down. The granaries of the wealthy remained locked, their contents a taunt to the starving populace who had harvested it. We can see this shift through the eyes of another figure, Father Thomas, the village priest. His role was to offer spiritual comfort, to remind his flock of God's eternal plan. But how do you speak of heavenly bread when the earthly kind has vanished? His parishioners came to him not just for prayer, but with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. He would distribute what little the church had, his own rations dwindling, his sermons growing more strained. He saw the fabric of his community, once woven tight with shared traditions and mutual support, begin to fray. Neighbor looked upon neighbor with a new kind of suspicion. A wisp of smoke from a chimney was no longer a sign of comforting domesticity, but a potential secret. Someone had found food. A plump child was looked upon, not with affection, but with a flicker of envy, and sometimes a dark question. The small acts of charity that defined village life began to dry up, not from a lack of kindness, but from a terrifying lack of anything to give. Each family became an island, guarding its own tiny, dwindling store of resources. The nobles in their cold stone keeps were not immune. While they did not starve, they felt the famine in other ways. Their income, derived from the land, vanished. Their authority was challenged by the desperation of their tenants. Lord Alaric, let us call him, would look out from his battlements, not at a productive estate, but at a brown, desolate wasteland. His nights reported increasing unrest, bands of desperate men roaming the countryside, poaching the Lord's deer, robbing travelers, their hunger overriding their fear of the gallows. The very structures of feudalism, built on the foundation of agricultural surplus, were beginning to shudder. By the time the first snows of winter arrived, they fell not on a sleeping, well-fed world, but on a landscape of profound suffering. The snow was a cruel blanket, hiding the dead fields, but offering no warmth. For the Bouchard family, the last of the salted meat was gone. Their meals were now a thin, watery gruel made from boiled acorns and whatever roots John could dig from the frozen ground. The fire was their only comfort, a lone point of light and warmth in a world that had grown cold and dark. They would huddle together, telling stories, not of heroes and dragons, but of feasts. They would describe, in painstaking detail, the taste of roasted chicken, the smell of a fresh loaf of bread, the sweetness of a summer apple. They fed themselves on memory, because there was nothing else left. The empty fields had led to empty tables. The empty tables were now leading to empty-handed authority and hollowed-out communities. The physical hunger was immense, but it was accompanied by a deeper starvation, a starvation for normalcy, for hope, for a sign that the world had not been utterly abandoned, and the worst, everyone knew, was yet to come. The winter had only just begun. The winter of 1316 was not merely a season, it was an ordeal. The cold, which in normal times was a familiar adversary, became an executioner. For a body already weakened by months of malnutrition, the chill was a relentless thief of what little energy remained. The very act of shivering burned calories that could not be replaced. The weak, the elderly, and the very young began to succumb. Death, once a visitor for the aged or the unlucky, became a resident in every village. The church bells, which once tolled for individual souls, now fell silent. There were simply too many to mark. The famine had entered a new, more terrifying phase. It was no longer just about hunger. It was about the complete breakdown of the human world. The bonds of society, stretched to their limit, began to snap. In the cities, the situation was just as dire, if not more so. Throngs of skeletal figures, refugees from the dead countryside, flooded the towns, begging for bread that did not exist. They huddled in alleyways, their bodies covered in rags, their eyes vacant with a despair that was beyond tears. Disease, the ever-present shadow of malnutrition, began its grim work. With immune systems shattered by hunger, populations became breeding grounds for epidemics. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the crowded, unsanitary streets, reaping a harvest of their own. This was a time when the darkest aspects of human nature, long held in check by law and faith, were unleashed. The bands of starving men roaming the countryside grew bolder. They were no longer just poachers, they were bandits, their desperation having extinguished their morality. They would raid isolated farmsteads, taking by force the last miserable handful of grain from families as desperate as their own. Travel became impossible. The roads, once arteries of life and commerce, became gauntlets of terror. And then there were the whispers, the stories that were told in hushed, horrified tones around sputtering fires, stories that history has tried to forget, but which the chronicles of the time recorded with grim honesty. Stories of cannibalism. It began with the desecration of the dead. Fresh graves were robbed for their occupants. Then it escalated. There were accounts of travelers being ambushed, of children disappearing, of the most sacred taboo being broken in the name of survival. While these were extreme cases, the fact that they were recorded by multiple sober sources tells us everything we need to know about the depth of the despair. It was the ultimate sign that the world had been turned upside down, that the moral compass of Christendom had been shattered. Let us return to Father Thomas, our village priest. His church was no longer a sanctuary of hope, but a hospice for the dying. He spent his days administering last rites, his own hands trembling from hunger. He saw the goodness in his flock curdle into something else. He saw a mother who could no longer feed her own child, turn her face away in shame and agony. He saw honest men he had known his entire life, become thieves. He preached of hell, but his parishioners were already living in it. His faith was tested not by heretics, but by the hollow eyes of a starving child, looking to him for an answer he did not have. And what of the kings and princes? What of the great powers of the world? Edward II of England, a king already struggling with political turmoil, found his authority crumbling. He tried to implement price controls on food, a move that backfired disastrously, causing merchants to hoard what little grain they had rather than sell it at a loss. The royal court itself was forced to ration, a sign of how total the crisis had become. In France, the king and his nobles were powerless. How can you command the rain to stop? How can you wage war against a famine? Their entire system of governance, designed for a world of predictable harvests, was utterly inadequate for this new reality. A kingdom, for all its knights and castles and laws, was on its knees, humbled by the sky. For the Bouchard family, survival had become a series of desperate calculations. Jean had grown gaunt, his strong frame now skeletal. Isabel spent her days scraping lichen from rocks and boiling leather from old shoes to create a semblance of broth. The children no longer asked for bread, they no longer had the energy, they lay by the weak fire, their small bodies racked with a quiet, constant hunger. The family, once a unit of warmth and life, had become a fragile huddle of survivors. Their world shrunk to the four walls of their cottage, and the relentless gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The spring of 1316 offered no relief. The rains continued. The planting season failed again. There was now a terrifying realization dawning on all of Europe. This was not a bad year. This was the new world. There was no end in sight. The darkness was absolute, and the hope that had sustained them through the first winter had been all but extinguished. In the midst of absolute despair, when it seems that all light has been extinguished, the human spirit reveals its most profound and mysterious quality, resilience. It is a quiet, stubborn thing. It is not the roar of a king, but the whisper of a mother singing a lullaby to a hungry child. It is not the charge of a knight, but the shared crust of bread between two starving strangers. As the long winter of 1316 bled into another failed spring, these small, defiant glimmers of light began to pierce the gloom. The famine had stripped away everything: wealth, status, certainty. And in that stripping, something essential was revealed. Community, which had frayed under the initial shock, began to reform in new and powerful ways. When the formal structures of lord and priest failed, people turned to each other. The village, which had become a collection of suspicious islands, slowly, cautiously, began to rebuild its bridges. It happened in the smallest of ways. A woman who had managed to forage a handful of edible roots would leave a portion on the doorstep of her neighbor, whose children were too weak to walk. A man who had found a bird's nest with a few precious eggs would share them with the elderly widow next door. These were not acts of grand charity, they were acts of shared existence. They were a quiet acknowledgement that your survival is tied to my own. In a world where every calorie was a treasure, to give one away was the ultimate act of faith. Let us revisit the Bouchard family. Jean, weakened but not broken, had learned the secret language of the starving land. He knew which barks could be boiled to soften them, which mosses were safe to eat, how to grind acorns into a coarse, bitter flour that could sustain life, if not pleasure. He joined other men from the village, not in suspicion, but in cooperation. They would pool their knowledge and their energy foraging together, protecting each other from bandits, sharing whatever meager bounty they could find. The hunt for food became a communal effort, a quiet rebellion against the solitude of starvation. Inside the cottage, Isabel was a guardian of a different kind of flame. She guarded memory and hope. When the physical world offered nothing but misery, she wove a world of stories. She told her children tales of the time before, of sun-drenched feasts and fields of golden wheat. These were more than just distractions. They were a lifeline to a reality they had to believe would one day return. They were a reminder that the world was not always grey. She would sing old songs, her voice thin but steady, the melodies a fragile shield against the howling wind. In doing so, she was not just comforting her children, she was tending to the very soul of her family. Even Father Thomas, our priest, found a new purpose. His formal sermons on an abstract God had felt hollow. Now, his ministry became one of physical presence. He could not offer bread, but he could offer a hand to hold. He organized the women of the village to care for the orphaned children, creating a makeshift family from the wreckage of many. He sat with the dying, not offering platitudes, but simply bearing witness to their suffering, giving them the dignity of not having to face the end alone. His faith was no longer in the heavens, but in the sacred, unbreakable bond of human connection. This resilience was not just passive endurance, it was an active, creative force. People rediscovered ancient knowledge that the years of plenty had allowed them to forget. They learned to fish with makeshift nets in the swollen rivers. They learned to trap small game. They found sustenance in the weeds and wild herbs that grew in the margins of their dead fields. It was a brutal education, but it was an education in survival. And even in the darkness, the fundamental rituals of life persisted, imbued with a new, desperate poignancy. A wedding would still be celebrated, not with a feast but with a shared prayer and a promise for a future they had to believe in. A new baby, born into this starving world, would be seen not as another mouth to feed, but as a defiant symbol of life's insistence on continuing. These small acts were a testament to a spirit that refused to be extinguished. They were saying to the indifferent sky, "You can take our harvest, you can take our strength, but you cannot take our humanity." The year 1317 finally brought a change. The rains at last began to subside. The summer was still cool and wet, but there were days of sun. A small, pathetic harvest was possible. It was not enough to end the famine, but it was enough to spark hope. It was a sign that the world had not ended. The great wheel of the seasons, which had been stuck for so long, had begun, ever so slowly, to turn again. For the survivors, gaunt and scarred, who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, The sight of a single head of wheat ripening in the weak sun was a miracle more profound than any story of old. It was a promise, whispered at last, that life could begin again. The sun that rose in the summer of 1317 was a tentative, watery thing. It did not banish the memory of the long rain, but it did begin to dry the sodden earth. Slowly, painstakingly, life began to seep back into the world. The fields were replanted. The harvests, though small for years to come, were harvests nonetheless. The rhythm of the seasons, the fundamental promise between humanity and the earth, was cautiously renewed. But a wound so deep does not heal without a scar. Europe emerged from the Great Famine a changed place. It was a quieter, emptier world. Millions had perished, perhaps as much as 15% of the population in some areas. Whole villages had been wiped from the map, their cottages slowly collapsing back into the earth, their fields overgrown. The generation that survived would carry the memory of the hunger in their very bones for the rest of their lives. They were known as the survivors, the ones who had looked into the abyss and had not fallen. The scars were not just demographic, they were psychological. The buoyant optimism of the High Middle Ages was gone, replaced by a more sober, more fragile understanding of the world. People had learned a terrible lesson that civilization is a thin veneer, that prosperity is fleeting, and that the world is not always a benevolent place. This profound sense of vulnerability would echo for decades, shaping art, religion, and politics. The spectre of the famine would haunt the European mind, a grim reminder of how quickly the world could be turned upside down. Our story, the story of the Bouchards, of Father Thomas, of a continent brought to its knees, is more than just a chronicle of suffering. It is a testament to what is left when everything is taken away. It reminds us that our true wealth is not in our granaries, but in our connections to one another. That in the darkest of nights, the smallest acts of kindness can shine like stars. And that hope is not the absence of fear, but the decision to light a candle, however small, in the face of overwhelming darkness. The survivors of the Great Famine did not endure because they were strong, but because they held on to their shared humanity when it was all they had left. Look now, at the fire before us. See how the embers pulse with a gentle, steady light. They are like those small, defiant acts of hope we witnessed. The world outside our window may be loud and complicated, full of its own storms and uncertainties, but here in this quiet moment, we can feel the enduring warmth of that same human spirit. The stories change, the centuries turn, but the fundamental struggles of life, loss, and endurance remain the same. Theirs was a long winter, and they faced it with courage. May we, in our own times of trial, remember their quiet resilience. May we remember that even after the most relentless rain, the sun, eventually, does return. The fire is burning low now, and the night grows deep. It is time for you to rest. Thank you for traveling back with me to this forgotten corner of the past. May your sleep be peaceful, and may your dreams be warmer than the winter we have just left behind. Good night, traveler. Rest well.